There was a small room in London where the future did not sound like applause. It sounded like cardboard. A little boy sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes his family probably thought were only boxes. To him, they were drums. They were a stage. They were a secret language. He did not have the right kit yet. He did not have the lights, the screaming crowds, or the serious men in studios asking him to do one more take. He had his hands. He had rhythm. And he had that strange, private hunger some children carry before they even know what ambition means. Phil Collins would tap on anything that made a sound. Boxes, tables, chairs, his own knees. The house could be quiet, but inside him something was already moving. It was not loud in a showy way. It was constant, like a little engine that refused to stop. One afternoon, in this remembered version of the story, an older musician watched the boy play on those boxes. Not a famous prophet, not a man with a spotlight around him, just someone who knew music well enough to recognize when rhythm was not being learned, but released. The boy played with such seriousness that it almost looked funny. His face tightened, his shoulders leaned forward. He was not pretending to be a star. He was concentrating like a working drummer twice his age. The older musician smiled and said something that Phil did not fully understand. "You keep time like a drummer," he said. "But one day, boy, people are going to listen to your voice." Phil looked up, confused. "My voice?" The man nodded. "Yes, you will sing. And when you do, it will shock everyone." At the time, it must have sounded almost ridiculous. Phil was the child with the rhythm, not the child with the grand voice. He was the boy behind the beat, not the boy at the front of the room. Some children dream of being seen. Phil, in many ways, seemed built to sit behind the kit and hold everything together for others. But that is the strange thing about destiny. It often tells the truth too early, when nobody is ready to believe it. Years later, the world would know Phil Collins as one of the most recognizable voices in popular music. But before that voice carried across radio stations and arenas, it lived quietly behind cymbals. Before people sang with him, they barely expected him to step forward at all. And before Genesis needed a new singer, Phil himself may have believed the safest place in the world was behind the drums. That is where he could disappear and control everything at the same time. Behind a drum kit, a man can be essential without being exposed. He can drive the song without having every eye on his face. He can feel everything and still hide behind motion. The arms move, the foot keeps time, the sweat falls, and the audience looks toward the singer. For a long time, that suited Phil. When Genesis found him, he was not brought in as the front man. Peter Gabriel had that role. Peter had the costumes, the theatrical imagination, the strange magic that made early Genesis feel like another world. Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford, Steve Hackett, and Phil built something complex, careful, and ambitious. The music was not simple. It had long passages, shifting moods, and quiet details that rewarded patient listeners. Phil sat behind the kit and gave the band its pulse. He had feel. That was the thing, not just speed, not just precision. Feel. He could make difficult music breathe. He could push and pull without breaking the spell. He had the gift every great drummer has. He made other people sound better. But that old sentence from childhood sat somewhere in the shadows. One day, people are going to listen to your voice. He did sing sometimes, Backing parts, harmonies, small moments. Nothing that seemed to threaten the natural order of things. Peter was the singer. Phil was the drummer. The band had its shape. Then, in 1975, Peter Gabriel left Genesis, and suddenly the room changed. It is hard to explain now, after all the success that came later, how dangerous that moment felt. A band can survive losing a member, but losing the face, the voice, and the strange theatrical center of the band is something else. Fans had attached the world of Genesis to Peter's presence. Promoters worried. The press wondered. The band searched. They auditioned singers. One after another, voices came into the room. Some were strong. Some were polished. Some probably wanted the job badly. But something did not land. The band was looking for a replacement, but maybe what they needed was not a replacement at all. Phil sat nearby, listening. That must have been the painful irony. The answer was in the room, but it was sitting behind the drums. And maybe that is why the moment became so frightening. Because when people finally began to look at Phil, they were not just asking him to sing. They were asking him to stop hiding. The boy who tapped on cardboard boxes had become the man keeping Genesis alive from the back of the stage. And now the band was asking him to walk forward. There are moments in a life when the thing you were trying not to become turns out to be the only door left open. For Phil Collins, the microphone was not just an opportunity. It was a test of exposure. At the drums, he could sweat, work, support, react. At the microphone, there was nowhere to disappear. Every hesitation had a face. Every crack in the voice belonged to him. And yet, when he sang, the room heard it. Not because he sounded like Peter Gabriel. He did not. That was the shock. He sounded like Phil Collins, clearer, more direct, more human in a different way. Less theatrical, perhaps, but closer to the listener. His voice did not arrive wearing a mask. It arrived like someone speaking from the middle of a feeling. The band did not become less serious because Phil sang. It became more vulnerable. But at first, the public did not know what to do with him. Imagine the pressure of standing before an audience that has already decided who is missing. Imagine stepping to the microphone and knowing some people are not there to hear you. They are there to compare you. They are there to decide whether the band has lost its soul. They are there with folded arms waiting for proof. Phil had spent years mastering rhythm. Now he had to master doubt, and doubt has its own tempo. Night after night he walked into that impossible space between loyalty and reinvention. Behind him were the drums, the place where his body understood the world. In front of him was the microphone, the place where his fear had to become sound. He had to keep Genesis moving, not by pretending nothing had changed, but by surviving the change in public. That is why the childhood moment matters, because the older musician had not simply predicted a career, he had seen a contradiction. The boy made rhythm with his hands, but somewhere inside him was a voice waiting for a crisis big enough to release it. The prophecy did not come true gently. It came true because someone left. It came true because a band nearly lost its center. It came true because Phil Collins had to choose between staying safe behind the kit and becoming visible enough to be judged. And the shocking part was not that he could sing. The shocking part was that the world almost never heard him, because for years even he seemed to believe he belonged behind someone else. But that was not the end of the shock. When Phil finally stepped forward, success did not arrive like comfort. It arrived like another demand. Genesis survived. Then Genesis grew. The shows became bigger. The expectations became heavier. And the man who had once been the drummer was now carrying two ghosts at once. The ghost of the singer who left, and the ghost of the boy who had been told his voice would matter before he believed it himself. Fans eventually accepted him. Then they loved him. Then millions of people who had never cared about progressive rock heard that voice and felt they knew him. But being known by millions is not the same as being understood. As the years moved toward the 1980s, Phil's life became louder on the outside and more complicated inside. His marriage was under strain. He was traveling, recording, performing, trying to be present in rooms he could not always reach. There were stages, airports, studios, hotel corridors, and quiet phone calls that ended with more silence than comfort. The man with perfect timing could not always be on time for the people he loved. That is a cruel truth for any musician, but it felt especially cruel for Phil. His gift was timing. He could feel the small space before a beat. He could sense where a song needed lift, restraint, impact, release. But family life does not follow a click track. A child does not wait forever. A marriage does not pause until the tour is over. A home does not stay warm just because the world outside is cheering. And somewhere in that painful distance, the voice deepened. By the time face value began to take shape, Phil was no longer simply the surprising singer of Genesis. He was a man trying to understand what had happened to his own life. The songs did not feel like costumes. They felt like rooms with the lights turned low. The famous drum sound, the lonely atmosphere, the ache in the singing, all of it carried the sense of someone who had stopped performing happiness and started recording what silence felt like. That is what made his voice so powerful. It did not sound perfect because life was perfect. It sounded unforgettable because it had been scraped against disappointment. And perhaps that is what the old musician had heard in the boy. Not just the ability to sing notes. Lots of people can sing notes. He had heard a kind of emotional rhythm, the kind that later lets a man turn private damage into public language. The boy tapped boxes because he needed to make the world answer him. The man sang because the world had finally hurt him enough to make him answer back. There is a difference. The public often remembers the big moments, the stadiums, the hits, the videos, the drum fill that seemed to fall from the sky. But behind those moments is a quieter story about a person being pushed again and again into places he did not ask to stand. First, the child was told his voice would matter. Then the drummer had to become a singer. Then the singer had to become a star. Then the star had to keep singing while the private man behind the songs was breaking. That is why Phil Collins can feel so familiar to people who lived through those years. He was not distant in the way some rock stars were distant. Even when he was famous, there was something ordinary in him, something wounded, funny, tired, restless, and stubbornly human. He looked like a man who might tell a joke in the dressing room, then sit alone later and wonder how things had gone so far. His voice carried that. It carried the working drummer. It carried the divorced husband. It carried the father trying to make sense of absence. It carried the boy on the floor with the cardboard boxes. And when listeners heard him, Many heard their own lives in the cracks between the words. They heard marriages that did not survive, jobs that took too much, children growing up too fast. The feeling of discovering your real purpose only after something has been taken from you. The world thought Phil Collins found his voice when Genesis needed a singer. But maybe the truth is more painful. Maybe he found his voice every time life gave him something he could not fix with rhythm alone. Years after the first shock, after Genesis had become an entirely different kind of giant, after Phil had crossed into solo superstardom, that childhood sentence would have looked almost impossible. People did listen to his voice. They listened in cars, kitchens, bedrooms, hospitals, bars, and lonely houses after midnight. They listened when they were heartbroken. They listened when they were angry. They listened when they did not know how to say what they felt. And yet, the voice that reached them had not come from comfort. It came from being cornered by change. It came from standing where he never expected to stand. It came from the strange burden of discovering that the thing inside you is bigger than the place you chose to hide. That is the hidden beauty of the story. A child thought he was only keeping time. A musician heard something more. The band later needed what the child did not understand. And the world was shocked because the drummer did not just sing. He revealed himself. Maybe every life has a version of that moment. Someone sees something in us before we can see it. We dismiss it. We hide from it. We build an identity around something safer. Then, years later, loss or pressure or necessity pulls the curtain back, and there it is. The voice. The part we avoided. The part that was waiting. Phil Collins became famous for many things. The drums, the songs, the humor, the heartbreak, the impossible climb from the back of Genesis to the center of the world's radio dial. But underneath all of that is the image of a boy on the floor making music out of boxes, being told a future he was too young to believe. And maybe that is why his story still moves people. Because it reminds us that sometimes the gift we are known for is not the first gift we trust. Sometimes life has to take away the hiding place before the real voice comes out. And when Phil Collins finally stepped to the microphone, the world heard more than a singer. It heard a boy who had been keeping time his whole life, finally learning that his own heartbeat was the song. If stories like this remind you why this music still matters, subscribe for more untold stories from Phil Collins, who gave everything to the music.